Seches Megillah Daf Yudches begins as the Gemara is wrapping up its discussion of Shemona Esrei and why the 18 brachos are arranged in the particular order in which they are. The Gemara will then continue working through our Mishnah line by line and discussing the halachos that it says therein about reading the Megillah. So we're up to the bracha of Binin Yerushalayim. We said after we're mispal for Hakadosh Baruch Hu to rebuild Yerushalayim, then we're mispal for the coming of David HaMelech and Mashiach come to Yerushalayim, as it says in the pasuk in Hosea. Achar Yeshuva b'nei Yisrael uvikshu es Hashem Elokeihem ve'es David Malcolm. After the return, then we can start asking for David. Now, once we have that, then we go on to another thing in Yeshaya. Well, this is in Yeshaya where we say, once we have the return of David HaMelech, then we can ask for tefillah, and therefore our next bracha is ritzei, that Hashem should accept our tefillah. Following that, we do the rest of that pasuk, which is the same as Zivchem l'ratzon al mizbechi. We talk about avoda, that Hashem should be mekabel our avoda. Now, avoda is followed by toda, by thanksgiving, which is a bracha of modim. And the reason for that is a pasuk which says, it's a pasuk in the Tehillim which says, Zoveach Toda Yechabdenani. So Zoveach, which is Karbanos, is followed by Toda, by Thanksgiving. So now after Modim we have Berchos Kahanim. It gets put in there in Chazar Sashatz. The Gemara says, why does Berchos Kahanim go after Hoda, after Thanksgiving? The Gemara quotes the pasuk in Vayikra, which says, Vayisa Aaron as Yadam El Ha'am Vayavarchem Vayered Me'asas Chatas Ve'Ha'ol V'Ashlamim. And Aaron, when he finished doing the Chatas and the Ol and the Shlamim, he lifted his hands to the people and he blessed them. So you see that Aaron's bracha comes right after the Avoda. So after we discussed Avoda, so we're going to have Berchos Kahanim. Someone says, hold on a second. First of all, it says Vayisa Aaron's Yadam before it talks about the Avoda. Someone says, yeah, it says it before, but it's obviously chronologically it happened afterwards, because it says he went down from doing the Chatas, the Ola, and the Shlamim, because it was already done when he began the bracha. So next thing Gemara says, but shouldn't then you should have a Berchos Kahanim right after Avoda? Why do you have Toda in between? So Gemara says, no, because we said Zoveach Toda. We said that Toda has to come after Avoda. Gemara says, okay, so you have a contradiction between Psukim. What should follow Avoda? Is it Toda should follow Avoda, like it says Zoveach Toda? Or is it Berchos Kahanim, like it says Vayisa Arnes Yadam after Vayered Me'asas Chatas Va'ola? So Gemara says it's logical that Toda should go together with Avoda, because Toda, giving thanks to Kadosh Baruch Hu, is a part of Avoda. It's part of the Avoda procedure, and therefore those two things will go together. And therefore Berchos Kahanim is pushed until after Toda. Now afterwards you have some Shalom, the bracha for peace. Gemara says that comes after Berchos Kahanim, like it says, V'sam l'shmi al b'nei Yisrael v'ani avarchem. You put my name, you Kahanim put your name, put my name on the Jewish people, and I will bless them. And the bracha of Kadosh Baruch Hu is Shalom, like it says, Hashem yivarach esem el bas Shalom. So you see Shalom, which is the bracha, comes right after Berchos Kahanim. Okay, now the Gemara says, when we had introduced this entire discussion, we had said that it was from Shimon HaPakuli and 180 and 120 Zakenim, which are the Anshe Knesset Agdol. The Gemara says, if you have 120 Zakenim of the Anshe Knesset Agdol, which included Nevi'im, what is the function of Shimon HaPakuli? What do you need him for? So the Gemara says, after the Anshe Knesset Agdol had set it up in this order, we forgot it. Shimon HaPakuli was able to restore the correct order through the logic. Okay, now the Gemara says, one is not allowed to be mishabech, is not allowed to praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu more than the brachos that are set up by the Chacham. You can't add your own things. And the reason, obviously, is because you can never do justice. You can never fully praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu enough, because it's infinite. And therefore, if you do more than Chazal said, it sounds like you're saying this much and not more, and that would be a terrible thing to say. So, the Gemara gives a source for this. The Gemara says, Mi yimal gvuras Hashem yashmiya kol tehillah. So, that is a pasuk in Tehillim. So Gemara says that it says, who is the one who is fitting to be Malach Gvuras Hashem, to speak of the praise of the strength of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? That is only one who could be Yashmiya Kol Tehillah, so who can actually say all his praise. And since there is no limit to his praise, it's infinite, can't be said by anybody, and therefore do not say anything on your own more than what Chazal said that you should say. This, of course, is referring to brachos and Shemona Esrei. It's not referring to in your daily language and speak, which you're allowed to. Now, the Gemara adds on a similar vein. Rabbi Chana says, somebody who praises HaKadosh Baruch Hu more than he's supposed to is uprooted from the world, again, because he's placing a limit on it. And he quotes a pasuk, "Ha'isupar lo ki adaber, im amar ish ki yivala." If you add and speak as you relate, then you will be swallowed up. Similarly, a drasha of Rav Yehuda, ish kfar givurya, or ish kfar gibor chayil. The pasuk says, "Lecha domia sehila," that for you is likeness. For you silence is praise. So the Gemara says that means that the best medicine of all is silence. And Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, said if a word costs a selah, is worth a selah, then silence should be worth 2 selaim. Okay, that concludes the Gemara's discussion of Shemoneh Esrei and Tefillah. The Gemara is now going to go into our Mishnah line by line. So the first halacha which we saw there was somebody who says the Megillah, he reads it by heart, is not yotz, it doesn't fulfill it. You have to actually read it from within the text. How do you know that? The Gemara says it comes from the word zechira. It says vayamim ha'ila nizkarim. These days are nizkar, and it says about the mitzvah of mechias amalek. It says k'soiv zois zikaron basefer. Right? This says a zikaron and a sefer. So you have nizkarim and zikaron; those are linked together. And just like by mechias amalek, it says k'soiv, write it, zikaron basefer, in a book. So therefore, Megillah has to be in a book. This is hold on a second. Zechira here doesn't necessarily mean reading from the book. Zechira could just mean looking in the book, reading with your eyes. Just zechira, the word, could mean remembering something. It doesn't have to be mentioning it. It has either meaning. So how do you know which one this means? Or maybe it just means to think about it. Somewhere says no, because if you look in the pasuk of Mechias Amalek, it says zechor and al tishkach, lo tishkach. So lo tishkach means don't forget. What's the difference between remember and don't forget? Those are the same. So it must be that when it says zechar, it doesn't just mean remember with your mind, it means to actually mention it with your mouth. And therefore, in Megillah, we're also talking about mentioning it with your mouth. Okay, next halacha in the Mishnah was that if somebody says he reads the Megillah in a different language, he's not yotza. So Gemara says, what would be the case where the only problem is that it's a different language? You just told me it has to be written, has to be read from something that's written. How could you read it in a different language? That means you're translating as you're speaking. So Gemara says it's referring to where you had a Megillah that was written in a different language. Even reading that exact text from the written version, that doesn't count. You're not yotza for that. Okay, next halacha, the Mishnah said that you're allowed to read it in a foreign language for people who speak that language. The Mishnah says it seems to contradict the halacha that you can't read it in a different language. The Mishnah says Rav and Shmuel says no problem. Resolution to the contradiction is that you're allowed to read it in Greek. Greek is different than all the other languages. Other languages you can't read it in Greek, you are allowed to. So Gemara again says it has to be that it's written in Greek, otherwise you have the same problem of it being read without a text. And I think Gemara has a number of other kashas up here. The Gemara brings a brisa. Well, first, the Gemara interrupts here because that statement that has to be written in Greek is from Rav Acha, name of Rav Elazar. The Gemara brings another thing that he says. He says that on the pasuk Vayikra Loi El Elokei Yisrael, when Yaakov built a mizbeach, it says he called it El, the God of Israel. So Rav Acha says the name of Rav Elazar, it cannot be that this is Yaakov calling a name to the Mizbeach, because then it should say Vayikra Lo Yaakov Elokei Yisrael. It means that Yaakov was called El. Vayikra Lo El, he was called El. Who called him El? Elokei Yisrael. So Hashem called Yaakov El. That's how you read that pasuk. Alright, now back to the discussion of reading the Megillah in foreign languages. So we had said that our Mishnah says you could read it in any language to people who understand that language. Rav and Shmuel said that has to mean Greek. So Mark asks, we have a brisa that clearly says not just Greek. The brisa says you're allowed to read it in Giftis, Ivris, Ilmis, Modis, Yavanis. That's Coptic. Ivris is a other language. Ilmis is the people of Elam. Modis is Median, Yavanis is Greek. So you see that you could read it in all of these. So how are you allowed to read it in those languages? And where it says, obviously that's referring to where you're reading it to people. See, so the Brisa only says you can read it in those languages, but it has to mean that you're reading it into those languages to people who understand those languages. Otherwise it doesn't fit with our Mishnah. So the problem is that none of this fits with Rav and Shmuel, because this Brisa clearly lists 5 languages. Rav and Shmuel said that when we said you're allowed to read it for somebody in a language he understands, it's got to be Greek. So Gemara therefore says no. So Rav and Shmuel weren't talking about that. They're talking about something else. The Mishnah and the Brisa are saying the same thing. You're not allowed to read it in a language somebody doesn't understand. There's a foreign language somebody doesn't understand. If you're allowed to read it in a foreign language, you're not in Hebrew as long as it's understood by the person. Rav and Shmuel were speaking about reading the Megillah to somebody in a language he does not understand. Rav and Shmuel were saying you're allowed to read it in Greek, even to people who don't understand Greek. The Gemara says, but that's also contradicted by the Brisa. The Brisa said you could read Greek to Greeks, not to other people. The Gemara says, well, Rav and Shmuel disagree with that. Rav and Shmuel hold like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, who hold that Greek has the status of Hebrew as far as writing, and just like a Sefer Torah can be written in Greek, you're allowed to read the Megillah you're allowed to read the Megillah to everyone in Hebrew and also in Greek, because Greek has that honorary halacha. So Gemara says, so why don't they just say the halacha is like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel? So Gemara says, because Rav Shimon ben Gamliel said it about other Sfarim, that a Sefer Torah can be written in Greek. The Megillah, though, it says Kich Savam, has to be written in its language, in its script. You may think that there it's got to be Hebrew, you can't use Greek, and they're coming to tell you that even there, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel would say that you could use Greek. Okay, now back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said that everybody's Yotze if they hear it in Hebrew, even if they don't understand. The Gemara asks, why should that be? You don't understand what you're saying. The Gemara says, no, it's just like when women hear, women generally didn't learn in those days, they didn't understand Hebrew, or Ameras, people who never went to school, and they never learned, so they don't understand the Hebrew, they're still their Yotze. Ravina says, we also don't understand everything in the Megillah. It says, ha'achashtaranim b'nei ha'ramachim, those are Persian words, we don't know what those are. So we also don't understand everything. But the point is that we understand the story, they also understand the story, they know what it's about, it's mefarsim, the nes, it publicizes the miracle, and they hear the Megillah, they hear the Kriya, and they understand generally what's being said. Okay, next, the Mishnah said that if you read it choppy, that you read and stop, there you do fulfill the mitzvah, you are Yotze, and the Mishnah had called that Seirugin. Cornell says, this is a repeat of a Gemara we had in Rosh Hashanah, the Chacham didn't know what the word Seirugin means, and they learned from the maidservant in the house of Rebbe that she used the word Seirugin in her speech. The Chachamim came in groups, so she said, how long are you going to keep coming in Seirugin, Seirugin? And then they knew that that's what it means, that Seirugin means to come in groups with breaks between them. Reading the Megillah, Seirugin means to read in groups with breaks between the psukim. Now, a number of other things that the Chachamim learned from the house of Rebbe and from someone else. So we have the word chalug logos, which appears, it's a type of vegetable which appears in many mishnayos. They didn't know what that was, and they heard her saying to somebody who was eating parpachine, the type of vegetable which Rashi defines as pikakli. So he said, why are you scattering your chalug loch all around? So then they knew what that was. As far as the word silsila, they didn't know what that means. Like it says, a silsila was from Mecca. But they heard one of the maids say to someone who was curling his hair, how long are you going to be misalsal your hairs? Then they understood that salsal means to pay close attention and to work with something deeply. Next is the phrase, Hashach al Hashem Yehavcha in Tehillim. What is a Yehavcha? It says, throw on Hashem your Yehavcha. So Rabbi Chana says, I was walking with an Arab, and I was carrying a heavy thing, and he said, throw your Yehav on my camel. So then I knew Yehav meant the burden. Next is where it says in the pasuk in Yeshaya, "V'samti l'marash kipoid v'agbe mayim v'tateisio b'metatatei ashmad." I will tatei it with a tatei of shmad. What does that mean? So the Gemara says they heard a maidservant in Rebbe's house say, "Take a tatisa and a tati the house," and it was referring to a broom. So then they knew that that word means a broom. All right. Now, as far as reading Seirugin, halachically, so we had said that you're allowed. The Gemara says it's only Seirugin, but not Seirusin. Seirusin means out of order, like we said in the Mishnah. You're not allowed to read the Megillah out of order. Now, Rav Muna said in the name of Rav Yehuda that even if you read Seirugin, you read straight, just the breaks in between, if you take a break, which is long enough to finish the entire Megillah, you're not yet. So you have to go read again from the beginning. And Rav Yosef said that's the halacha. Abai asked Rav Yosef, when we say if the break is long enough to finish it, that means to finish it from where you're up to, or to read the entire thing from beginning to end. He said it means from beginning to end. Otherwise, every point in the Megillah has a different halacha as to how long the break should be. We can't have that. We have to have uniform halachos. Now the Gemara is going to discuss the halacha here a bit. It's not so clear. So the Gemara says Rav Abba, says name Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, that Rav says the halacha is like Rabbi Muna, and Shmuel says the halacha is against Rabbi Muna. Different version. That's the version in Surah. In Pumpadisa, they said it was Rav Kahana who said it in the name of Rav that the halacha is like Rabbi Muna, and Shmuel said the halacha is not like Rabbi Muna. And then the Gemara brings a different version of this, where it's the other way, where Shmuel said that the halacha is like Rabbi Muna, and Rav said that the halacha is not like Rabbi Muna. That was brought by Rav Bibi. Of course, as Rav Yosef says, Rav Bibi is probably right, because Shmuel is usually the one who is makbid, he's machmir for the opinions of individuals. Where do you see that? Totally different topic. Case of a shemeres yavam. So the halacha is when a woman falls to yibum, she has a connection to the brothers of her former husband that they are obligated in the mitzvah of yibum. That connection means that her sister is forbidden to marry them. Now, the question is, does that apply if there's only one brother, and therefore he definitely is the one who has to do the yibum, or does it apply even if there are multiple brothers who could do the yibum, and it's not clear which one is going to end up doing the yibum? So Rav Yehuda says it applies even if there's multiples, and Chacham say it applies if there's only one. So the nafkamina would be, let's say one of those brothers, let's say the younger brother goes and wants to marry the sister of the Yavama, he would not be able to do that according to Rabbi Yehuda. Zumar says that Shmuel said that we're choshesh for Rabbi Yehuda. Allah is like Rabbi Yehuda, even though he's the opinion of an individual against the group. So you see that Shmuel generally will do that. He will be machmir l'chumra for the individual against the group. Okay, now the Gemara quotes a brisa back to Hilchos Megillah. If the Megillah is missing a couple of letters or a couple of psukim, so and you read it properly, meaning you fill in what's missing, so that's fine. You answer with that. Gemara says, how could that be? You have a brisa that says that if there are rubbed out or torn letters, the Megillah is puzzle. Gemara says that's talking about where a majority is rubbed out or torn. I'm talking about where a minority is missing. As long as you have half the Megillah kosher, it's fine. Next, Gemara brings a brisa that says that if you left out a pasuk, you cannot say, "Oh, I'll finish the Megillah and I'll read that pasuk at the end." That would be out of order. Somebody walks into shul and they're in the middle of the Megillah, can't hear the end with them, and then say, I'll finish the beginning afterwards. That would also be out of order. He's got to read it in order. Okay, next halacha the Mishnah said was that if somebody hears it as he's drowsing, he's sleepy, then he's yetza. So Gemara says, what does that mean? That means that he's not sleeping and he's not awake, somewhere in between. If you call to him, he'll answer, but he cannot think logical thoughts or come up with a new conclusion on his own. And if you remind him, he'll remember. Okay, next halakha in the Mishnah was that if somebody says the Megillah as he's writing it, he's yotze as long as he has in mind, he has kavana to be yotze the Megillah. Someone says, what are we talking about over here? He's saying the pasuk and then he writes it, but then when he's saying it, it's not reading from anything, and that would be saying it bal peh. We said you're not yotze with that. Versus no, it's got to be that he's writing it and then he reads what he wrote. Which is that's also not good because he doesn't have a complete Megillah in front of him. We know we have a machlok is whether or not you have to read the whole Megillah. Machlok is whether you have to read from the beginning to the end or just from Mish Yehudi to the end. But everybody agrees you got to have the entire thing written in front of you. So how that would not work? So the Gemara says it has to be that he has the complete Megillah in front of him and he's reading from the complete Megillah and copying it over. He's saying a pasuk and writing it. He's reading from the Megillah, saying it, and writing it. The Gemara says, is this a proof to Rabbi Bar Bachana and Rav Yochanan who holds that you cannot write a sefer unless you have a complete one in front of you? Gemara says, no, that's not necessarily a proof. It could just be that that's the case. That's what he had. Now the Gemara goes into that halacha. Rabbi Bachana says, the name of Rav Yochanan, you cannot write even one letter unless you're writing it from a written text. So Gemara asks, Rav Shimon ben Elazar says, it was a story where Rabbi Meir went to Asya to be calculate whether it should be a leap year, and there was no Megillah there, and it was Adar, of course. So he wrote it out from memory, and he read it. So how is he allowed to do that? You just said you have to write everything from a written text. The Gemara says, no, Rabbi Meir is different. He has the entire Torah, the entire Megillah, spread out in front of him as if he's reading it. He has it in mind so well as if he's reading it. And the Gemara brings psukim. So it brings, Afapecha yashu negdecha. Your eyes should be looking straight ahead in front of you. So that's referring to Torah, somebody who has a Torah as if it's spread out in front of him. Because about a Torah it says, if you blink, you're going to forget it. So Rabbi Meir, so you see the discussion of eyes looking straight without being distracted refers to Torah. So on that, Rabbi Meir was able to fulfill having your eyes straight ahead. So now the Gemara says, Rav Chisda found Rav Chananel, who was writing Svarim Baal Peh. He said, look, you know the entire Torah Baal Peh, that's for sure, but the Chacham said you can't write anything, even one letter, without it being from a written text. So you see that even though he had it spread out in front of him, he knew it well, you still can't write it. So how could a mayor do it? Versus again, Rabbi Meir was in a Shas Tzchak. He was in a place where he didn't have a Megillah and he was stuck. He had no other option. Where says that Abai allowed the people of Bar Chavu to write tefillin and mezuzos Baal Peh by heart. And that's like a Tana. We have a brayso where Rabbi Yirmiyah says tefillin and mezuzos are allowed to be written by heart, and they don't require lines on the cloth. The brayso continues, says that the halacha is that mezuzah does require a line. Tefillin doesn't require lines, but tefillin and mezuzah are allowed to be written Baal Peh. But again, that's different. That's because those are tefillos that we say all the time, and therefore we could assume that people know it by heart. Another Gemara goes into the other chemicals and paper surfaces, materials you're allowed to use to write the Megillah. So we had mentioned sam. The Gemara defines it as a sambal, which Rashi says is called orpamento. Sikra is a red dye, Rashi says. Rabbi Chana says it's called sakarta. Kumus is kuma, that's the sap of a tree. So those are the inks that you can't use. Kankantum is shoe polish. Shouldn't use that either. And diphthera is hide, animal hide that's not processed properly, and therefore it's not full-on parchment. You shouldn't use that. And niyar is paper. You can't use that either. Now it's got to be written in Ksav Ashuris, in the Hebrew font. The Mishnah says the one we use today. So how do you know that? It says Kichzam v'chizmanam. Should be written like in their time. And also he said it has to be written on a sefer, in a scroll, and with ink. How do you know that? The Gemara says that comes from the word ksiva. It says it's a Xereshava, ksiva. It says here Vati Kasev Esther Malka, and it says in a pasuk in Yirmiyahu, Vayomer lehem barach mipiv yikra elai is called advar ma'ila va'ani kosev ala sefer badiyai. So you see that kosev refers to sefer and dio, so it refers to the scroll with ink, and those are the minimum requirements for writing a Megillah.